Hi, we're back talking about reflections on science. We left off discussing Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, a prominent physicist responsible for many ideas about black holes, quantum mechanics, unified field theory. And in his book, The Grand Design, Hawking says that philosophy has not kept up with modern discoveries in science, particularly physics. Now, the amusing bit here is that all scientific inquiry is philosophical. Science makes certain assumptions in its approach to understanding the world, and these assumptions really flow from a point of view, a philosophical point of view called positivism. This is an ideology or a world view. Now, no scientist is an objective machine. All scientists have a particular point of view, and the one that drives 20th and 21st century science is called positivism. Now, positivism was born out of the 19th century, mainly as a reaction to the church, a reaction to the dogma that kept people from investigating things. So positivism is a kind of reaction to superstition, but it's limited. It's based on a very simple idea. Seeing is believing. Just as you can see very clearly, I have an apple here in my hand, and I'd like to take a bite out of it, but actually it's a candle made of wax. So sometimes our eyes deceive us. Sometimes seeing isn't really believing, but physical science properly is concerned with that part of existence which can be directly observed, quantified, mathematically interpreted. So the problem is, when we talk about consciousness, there's no mathematical model that exists that can comprehend the entirety of our experience, or even such a tiny part of our experience as our emotional life or our, our daily life. So while physical science is interested in the relationship between space and time, it leaves out many important things. And by leaving these things out, it becomes easier to study something, just as if we want to study a frog, we can knock the frog out with chloroform and then dissect him. But what our dissection reveals is the analysis of a dead organism. It doesn't really give us a hint as to why that organism exists or what life really is, where it comes from. So physical scientists, they try to resolve the problems of existence by examining the nature of three-dimensional space, particles as they move through a fourth dimension, time. Physicists are interested in the stuff that material objects are made of and how these objects move through space and time. As long as we can quantify these things, and as long as we have a mathematical formula for the velocity of a falling object, for example, we feel comfortable that we're capable of understanding material nature, especially when our formulas are useful. And the idea of usefulness has to do with exploitation. So mathematical formulas are useful in developing useful technologies for living. The idea of positivism is seeing as believing. Just as Harry Truman, the Missourian from the Show Me state, he said, well, show me. If you can show me how something works, then I'll believe it. There's no magic there. It's a mechanical extension of ordinary phenomena. So, beginning with Galileo, scientists were interested in the flight of a cannonball, for example, and you can learn a lot by studying the trajectory of a falling object. But the soul of a falling object is entirely different. So since the time of early civilization, man has developed considerably in applying different mathematical formulas to the movement of objects. This is useful, for example, in the field of war. If we understand how a cannonball moves, then we can understand how to destroy a building or enemy troops. But while you might be able to understand the flight of a cannonball, since it's an inanimate object, the flight of a hummingbird or the flight of human imagination is another thing entirely. The problem is we lack the proper scientific framework to study the human imagination or human emotions, human psychology, and not only human psychology, but the entire spectrum of consciousness, as long as we limit our study to 3 dimensions, atoms in the void, the path of falling objects, and purely physical problems. Now, positivism developed as a reaction to too much spirituality, you might say, on the part of the church and on the part of especially Christianity, which restricted study to the point where Galileo was prosecuted in court for thinking, for considering the flight of a cannonball, for aiming a telescope at the stars and trying to decipher the movements of the planets, because his point of view contradicted the received doctrine that the Earth is the center of the universe and that all the planets and stars move around the Earth. And for this he was punished. So, as a reaction to this kind of closed-mindedness and dogma, the dogma that brought about the Spanish Inquisition, later on, scientists developed this philosophy of positivism. Now, positivism means being positive about something in the sense that I can be positive that the train will arrive on time. But in the end, this is really an epistemological assumption, an idea about how we know, since it's based on empiric evidence. That is to say, the evidence of the senses, what I can see, taste, touch, feel, smell. These things are empirical evidence. And by only accepting empirical evidence, I rule out the evidence of the mind, the evidence of the intellect, and the evidence of higher levels of experience, including the experience of consciousness. But positivism flowed out of a particular framework for studying the universe that wanted to deny the spiritual element, because those who represented the spiritual element, the priests, the orthodoxy, were determined to control thought and control study and control science. So positivism, the idea that seeing is believing, flowed from an attempt to have a more restrictive view of what we can know. And the problem is, this restrictive view is really centered on what is useful, and what is useful and what is exploitative may not be good for humanity in the long run. It may not be the best epistemology because it might reveal some things about how to exploit matter, but it doesn't reveal everything about the nature of reality and really leaves out many important things in our lives. So, for example, John Locke had this idea of the labor theory of value. And the idea is something is valuable according to the labor that we invest in it. So a tree has value when it's chopped up into firewood because the man and his axe have added some value to the tree by chopping it up. The tree alone in the forest has no value. I can't make money from it. It just sits there looking nice. But the same tree, if I cut it up carefully, I could make it into lumber, which is even more valuable than firewood, or a finely constructed house, or even better, a musical instrument, like a cello. So the idea is that the more labor is invested into something, the more valuable it becomes. Now, in Sanskrit, labor or work translates into karma. So what Adam Smith and his economist disciples are really saying is that the more karma is invested into something, the more valuable it becomes. That's the labor theory of value. But if I reduce this argument to the point of absurdity, what I find is that it falls apart. It's completely invalid. The idea that a rainforest has value only as firewood is patently false, as we've seen. In fact, by removing rainforests and destroying trees, we destroy oxygen and do irreparable damage to the environment that cannot be calculated really in terms of dollars and cents. But those who are interested in exploitation and the labor theory of value have no interest in this. So the idea is a rainforest becomes valuable to me if I can cut it down, turn it into firewood. And then after I sell the firewood, I can invest the money in hog bellies or petroleum or something else. As long as I'm exploiting, I'm creating value. But this is wrong-headed because interminable exploitation of the environment is not sustainable. In fact, it's very destructive. What do you do when all the rainforests are gone? What do you do when all the oil has been burned? Very interesting book by a man named Schumacher. He was an economic thinker and economist in Britain, but he's really remembered for a book called Small is Beautiful. And there he takes issue with the labor theory of value. He points out that, he says, we are estranged from reality and inclined to treat as valueless everything that we have not made ourselves. Even Marx fell into this devastating error when he formulated the so-called labor theory of value. Now we have indeed labored to make some of the capital which today helps us to produce. A large fund of scientific, technological, and other knowledge, an elaborate physical infrastructure, innumerable types of sophisticated capital equipment, and so on. But all this is a small part of the total capital we're using, and far larger is the capital provided by nature, not by man. And we do not even recognize it as such. This larger part is now being used up at an alarming rate. And that is why it is an absurd and suicidal error to believe and act on the belief that the problem of production has been solved. So as we move into the 21st century, what we find is resources that we felt were inexhaustible in terms of water, um, petroleum, are being used up at an alarming rate. And as a consequence, uh, civilization itself runs the risk of falling apart. And you can just look around the world and see all the different crises that are going on. The refugees that flow from one country into the next are caused by wars, and the wars are caused by overexploitation of petroleum. And what Schumacher is saying here is that it's an illusion to think that by applying karmic energy to the destruction of all natural capital, we're creating wealth. In fact, we're destroying wealth, and by cutting down the forest to create houses, we apparently create wealth by extracting petroleum from the earth and turning it into fuel for heating those homes. We create more wealth and production, and the economy grows. And by making giant car factories, we create jobs and more wealth. But when we burn gasoline in our cars to speed people to work, we think we're creating more wealth. The problem is unlimited expansion and unbridled economic growth translates into greater wealth for everyone in theory. But Schumacher's pointing out here that infinite growth of material consumption in a finite world is an impossibility. Now, this gets back to the idea of positivism, since what positivism tells us is that it's good to exploit, that the point of science is to be useful. Any question which is not ultimately leading to something practical, pragmatic, and useful in terms of exploiting material nature, in terms of increasing the amount of labor that we can apply to material nature, in terms of, in effect, increasing karmic reaction. Anything that doesn't move in that direction is useless and should be discarded. So all questions that have to do with the origins, the nature of consciousness, the soul, must be discarded because they're not really practical. But in the end, the impracticality of exploitation is devastating. What Einstein, Hawking, all these scientists in the end have promoted are things like the atomic bomb, VX nerve gas, Zyklon B, the Holocaust of the Jews. All these things are based on scientific progress. Now, I'm not advocating that we throw away all scientific progress. That's to make the argument too easy, and that's what atheists like Hawking and Dawkins and Sam Harris immediately do. They jump to that conclusion saying, oh, well, if you're not interested in unlimited exploitation, then you're backwards thinking and you're superstitious. But it's easy to characterize arguments without really thinking or getting into the interior nature of reality. Now, scientists try to tell us that philosophy is dead because philosophy pursues the impossible dream. But really, it's the scientists themselves who pursue an impossible dream. Sometimes this is considered laudable. It's great to go for your dream. But oftentimes, the language of these very practical men it's really the language of fantasy, traveling at warp speed, Star Wars, Star Trek, Beam Me Up, Scotty, phasers, all these different technological solutions, in a real sense, are pipe dreams, and they're impossible. And to believe in impossibility is quixotic. It was Don Quixote, after all, who believed in the impossible dream. So while we have been taught and propagandized and schooled to believe in the impossible dream of absolute scientific progress, what we see in reality is very different. Anybody who doesn't believe me, try uploading a video onto YouTube or live streaming and see how easy it is. We're promised that so many things are just a click away, and using the internet will solve all our problems. But it's not as easy as it appears to be. Absolute scientific progress is another form of religious thought. And this sort of dogmatic religious thought flows from the 19th century philosophy of positivism. So, what we're going to try to explore in our talks is whether or not any reasonable alternative to this dogma exists. Positivism, the idea that science will bring absolute progress, is another kind of epistemological assumption. And so scientists like Hawking would have us believe that philosophy is dead. But this is a philosophical assumption. The idea that science has superseded philosophy. Hawking is very proud of the achievements that have been made in physical science, but he's overlooking many subtle questions and problems, as, for example, the assumption that he's making when he says that philosophy is dead. The idea that philosophy is dead is based on the concept that Kant set limits on what we can think and talk about with his critique of pure reason. But what Kant was saying is also very limited. He's using the idea of reason in a very limited sense. And we'll talk more about Kant later. But this feeling that science will solve everybody's problems, it's also called scientism. It's the belief that science is the perfect answer to everything. And this is really a different kind of philosophical or epistemological assumption, as we'll explore as we go along. Now, I use this word epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Well, this is really a fascinating area of study because it gets into metacognition, and metacognition gets into the problem of consciousness. So this is why consciousness is a hard problem for science. Before you can do science, you have to understand, well, how do we know things? How do I know that this is an apple, or is it a wax candle? How do I know this is an avocado? There's all these different ways of knowing, and that's called epistemology. How do we know what we know? Before we can investigate reality, we need a framework for organizing our knowledge, and we need to know what questions to ask. So Hawking and Dawkins, as well, and Sam Harris, all these men who promote atheism, are very determined to make sure that we don't ask any questions about God, the soul, or consciousness. Because as soon as we start asking these questions, we leave the school of scientism behind. The questions that we're told to ask are how to be more productive, or what is the trajectory of a cannonball? But these questions also imply a particular assumption. The question how to be more productive assumes that production is valuable. Such a question overlooks the cautions that we were just describing, made by Schumacher. The idea that it's possible to overexploit natural resources. And if I ask, well, what is the trajectory of a cannonball? My question shows that I assume that war and the instruments of war are useful tools to advance the interests of civilization. So all these different questions imply values. And it's very difficult to separate how we know what we know with what we value. Epistemology examines how we know and what can be known. And according to the positivists, it would be a waste of our time to ask about things that we cannot know. It's a sort of mental checkmate. Why ask a question if there's no answer? The sound of one hand clapping. But philosophy helps us to narrow our search by helping us to frame our questions. And by focusing our questions, we determine what we can understand and what we can't understand. Now, those who value the positivist world of Stephen Hawking, which only ask useful questions, they would try to limit our power to ask questions. And that's really the purpose of modern academe, to make sure that certain questions are not asked. They can only be asked in a certain kind of milieu or classroom. So if I want to know who am I can't ask that in the science classroom. It's not an appropriate question for physics, for biology, or even for philosophy. The psychologist might have something to say about that, but psychology itself is also very reductionist in that it's interested in behavior and controlling the behavior of the general populace so that people are happy and they work harder and they're more productive citizens, because the end goal of academia is to produce productive citizens. So we don't want citizens asking questions about who you are, how you came here, or what the goal of life is, because these questions are not productive. And since production is valued and the labor theory of reality is valuable, we're not allowed to enter into these things. And if you do, you may face sanctions. So we're not to question the world of karma. We're not to question why I'm here or why I'm doing what I'm doing. We're supposed to pick up the shovel and keep working. Or in the question of knowledge workers, because now the economy is moving towards knowledge workers, it's not a question of picking up a shovel, but it's a question of acquiring intellectual property and monetizing it. In this way, all ideas, all concepts, all intellectual movement should be financially monetized and converted into something useful. Otherwise, it's not useful and should be left aside. There was an interesting author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian emigre who lived in Vermont for many years. He wrote a book called Gulag Archipelago, which was lionized by the Western press because it criticized the communist system. And later he gave an address at Harvard University. And people were surprised that not only did he criticize the communist system, but he also criticized the capitalist one by saying that censorship is applied in totalitarian society by the government by the party bosses and the party mob, who make sure that you're not allowed to say certain things. But interestingly, he said, in the West, censorship is applied by the commercial mob. And what that means is if your ideas are not commercial, they're not making money, then they're useless because they have no practical purpose. So this concept of positivism, or what is practical, or the labor theory of value, it permeates many different layers of society to the point where it becomes impossible to have a conversation about who you are. And as we continue these talks, I'll talk more about some of the taboos that we face when we try to question the prevailing paradigm. And next up, we'll talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant and his critique of reason. So I hope you're enjoying this talk. So far, I have 9 views. As I continue to do this kind of work, I hope I'll get better at it. So thank you very much for tuning in and paying attention, and we'll see you again next time.